World with Carolyn. Yesterday there was a little bit of a scheduling conflict on the paper schedule. That was only for yesterday, only for this video. Everything you see on there is in PDF as well as online. So please put your hands together for Carolyn.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining me this morning. As James said, my name's Carolyn, and I'm here to talk to you this morning about a topic that's really kind of near and dear to my heart, development for the developing world. So just before we really dive in, a little bit about myself. I'm a developer at Spruce Labs here in Denver. We are an experience company, and our product Spruce Spot is leading the way in the guest first movement. And we are empowering brick and mortar retail stores of all sizes, mom and pop through Fortune 500, to really enhance and totally change the type of experience that their guests have in store. It's really cool stuff. If you want to know more about that, I highly recommend that you stick around for the 10 o'clock slot here. Taylor Ramiro is going to be telling us all about that. It's going to be awesome. But why am I here talking about this topic today? So before I got into development, I actually have a bachelor's degree in Latin American Studies and Political Science from Rutgers University. And I earned that degree through a lot of actual cultural anthropological research. Largely in the field, I spent a lot of time down in Cochabamba, Bolivia, living down there and doing ethnographic research, specifically with a lot of the marginalized, hugely impoverished communities that are living on the outskirts of that city. They also did a lot of work with some transnational migrant communities, more locally where I was living in New Jersey at the time. So this is just a topic that's always been really interesting to me. And as I've moved into my career in software development, it's something that I've never really lost interest in. And so I'm really excited to be here talking to you about it today, because for me, it's kind of like a merging of my worlds and my passions. So as I was preparing for this talk, I came across this quote. I'll read it so that, because we can't really read it up there. What might be innovation in a mature and developed economy will most probably be irrelevant in a growing and emerging market. And for me, this really just kind of hit the nail on the head in what I'm talking about today. It's from a woman named Sana Rao. She is a Silicon Valley designer, product designer, but she's also, she's from India. She spent the majority of her life growing up in developing India. So she has a really unique perspective on designing software for the first world, for developed economies, but really understanding all of the ways in which they don't apply into huge populations elsewhere in the world. So one of the reasons that I wanted to give this talk today is I think the secret has been out for a little bit that when we diversify our engineering teams, our product teams, our delivery teams, different genders, different races, creeds, just bring people with different life experiences onto those teams, it hugely enhances our problem-solving process, and it has an enormous impact on the types of solutions that come out of that process. And I think that we can achieve the same thing when we diversify the user base in which we're considering when we design new products. The developing world's users there are just as hungry, if not more, for innovation and technology, but in many, many ways, the developing world is a completely different world than the one that we're living in here. So they use technology, they interact with technology in completely different ways, and there's some incredible insights that we can take out of that. So before we get all the way into it, I want to just do a little bit of clarifying on what is a developing country. What am I talking about when I talk about the developing world? And truthfully, this is there's a lot of variance in this term. There's a lot of different ways to measure it. Generally speaking, talking about countries that are below average in a variety of different markers depending on the context in which you're speaking. So one of those things is standard of living. So that can be measurements like life expectancy, literacy rates, things that are affected by access to healthcare, for example, will play into all of that. Industrialization, so that can be things like basic civil infrastructure and all the implications that come from having below levels of industrialization per population. And then also basic economic factors, things like income per capita, GDP, all that kind of stuff. So again, we're talking below average. You'll see different lists in different places. For the purposes of this talk, I'm talking very high level, so I didn't drill this down to a specific list of countries, but these are a lot of the factors that we're taking into consideration for the context of this talk. So today, I want to go through three things. The first is some of the unique challenges that we see when we're considering user bases in the developing world that as developers and product teams, we might not have to either take into consideration at all when developing predominantly with the developed world in mind, or maybe just might not have to weigh quite as heavily. I want to look at some unsolved problems and Obviously, this isn't going to be an exhaustive or completely inclusive list, but what I'm thinking about here when we dive into this is problems that here in the developed world and first world economies, we typically see as having some pretty viable, applicable solutions that actually might still be gaping market holes in the developed world because the solutions that we have here just don't apply for a variety of reasons. And then we're going to look at some creative solutions. We're going to look at a couple of kind of mini case studies, some companies that actually are really hitting the mark and solving some of these problems, taking into consideration some of these challenges and really just knocking it out of the park. So to start with some of these challenges, the first thing I wanted to start with was reliable access to electricity. And the reason that I wanted to start with this one is because I think that in parts of the developing world, this is a huge problem. And as software developers, it's really easy to see this and decide that you don't want to go any further. If you're talking about users that don't have reliable access to electricity, how are they going to charge their phone? Would they even have a laptop or a computer of any kind? If so, how are they going to charge it? Do they even have the tools that are required to see the products that we're working so hard on? So I wanted to put that in context a little bit. This is particularly an issue, not exclusively, but in sub-Saharan Africa. Access to reliable electricity sources is definitely a huge issue in sub-Saharan Africa, amongst other parts of the world. So I just want to lay out some numbers for you to kind of put it in context. 400 million people have access to reliable electricity. 600 million people do not in that region. So more than half do not. However, 750 million people are reported mobile phone users. So to me right here, reliable access to electricity is not actually the bar to entry that we as software developers might think that it is. And this right here is a reason that it's definitely going to have huge implications on how users are interacting with their technology, and particularly things like smartphone applications. Battery power is probably going to be a much bigger priority for this type of user than somebody that can walk around with a power brick and really plug in anywhere they go, but absolutely not a bar to entry to leveraging technology. So another thing that we see is reliable and frequent access to high-speed internet. This is something that is huge throughout the developing world. It's not even something that's exclusively seen in the developing world. And just like in developed countries, it varies between metropolitan areas and more rural communities. Smartphone ownership is also a big one. So while mobile phone ownership is actually really high in all parts of the world, smartphone specifically ownership varies widely. Within the developed world, the average is around 59% of all mobile phone owners own smartphones, but the range is absolutely huge. So you have countries that are considered more emerging markets that are kind of right on the line of sometimes being considered a developing country where smartphone ownership is over 80%, and then countries that are hugely impoverished, always considered part of the developing world where it's less than a quarter. Language is a huge barrier. Voice-activated technology is so huge right now, especially in this country. We've got Google Assistant, Siri, Amazon Echo. Alexa only speaks 3 languages. She speaks English, German, and Japanese. So Alexa trying to penetrate the Latin American market, that's not going to happen until she learns Spanish, maybe Portuguese. So that's something that's a huge take into account. I do believe that both Google and Amazon have made initiatives to either by the end of this year or early next year start supporting closer to 30 languages. But until that happens, there's huge markets that these tools are largely useless. And then the final thing is cash-driven markets. Both for practical and cultural reasons, there's a lot of emerging economies and developing economies that still operate largely in cash-driven markets, and that can range everything from just lack of access to credit to use a credit card, to not having a smartphone to use that Apple Pay, to the vendor themselves not having reliable access to electricity or perhaps a reliable internet connection. That's going to have implications on their credit card reader. So they may prefer to operate in cash. So when you think about your Lyft ride, when was the last time anybody paid their driver in cash? It doesn't happen. So that's going to just create a whole new way of, again, interacting with and leveraging technology. So now that we've talked through some of the challenges, I want to then kind of roll this into, like I said, some of these huge market holes, some of these unsolved problems. Obviously, civil infrastructure itself is maybe not something that we would be solving with software, but I'm kind of using this just as a category to open our minds to what we're talking about. So in a country that doesn't have the same level of built up civil infrastructure, things like 2-day delivery, Amazon Prime, not going to be the thing that we have come to rely so heavily on. Many of us probably in this room, definitely in this country, just not an option in the same way. And again, going back to simple, smooth rideshare services, there's plenty of developed countries that have that in their main metropolitan areas, but once you get outside, financial transactions are another one. We probably all at least have the option to have our banks application on our smartphone where we can deposit checks, transfer money. We've got Venmo, we've got all of it. I can't remember the last time I went to a bank. A lot of that revolves around my bank having a secure API that they're willing to share and be able to develop that type of application. That doesn't happen in a lot of parts of the world. So even though there's other options for financial transactions, things like PayPal, if there's not that same type of support in the country in which you're operating, there's huge international transfer fees. There's usually currency conversion fees every step of the way. And it can make something like, we might know PayPal to be, I don't know, depending on the operation, somewhere like 3% fee tops. In parts of the developing world, it can go anywhere from like 15 to 30% between moving that money every step of the way, having larger, like I said, international transaction fees, plus exchange rate fees. It makes it completely not a great option. And then the last thing is adequate healthcare. So it can be directly affected by the civil infrastructure piece and just not being able to get to the doctor the way that some of us may be able to. It can affect the hardware, the technologies that are available to the doctor's office in which you're visiting. And so I think we can all just imagine implications that are falling out from this one. So I want to dive in a little bit to some of the companies, like I said, that have really taken on these challenges and become hugely successful as a result. And the first one I want to talk about is Ola Cabs. Ola Cabs is an awesome company. They are a rideshare service. They're the #1 rideshare service in India, and it's not because Uber's not there. Uber is there, Uber is trying, Ola Cabs has knocked them out. So how have they done it? The first thing they did is offer a wider scale of ride options. So they offer all the same things that you would expect from an Uber or a Lyft. We've got the regular rideshare, the XL, the luxury, black car, whatever you want to call it. But Ola Cabs also decided to open their service offerings to include things like auto rickshaws. So it totally lowers the price point and includes a whole sector of their user base that typically a service like this would be way too luxurious, way too expensive. So that was one of the first things that they did. They offer rentals in addition to actual ride shares where you're contracting a driver. They also carved out the whole piece of their services to serve rural users. So instead of just being SOL because you're out in the middle of nowhere and you either don't have service or there just aren't any drivers around, they developed a whole piece of their service offering to address that problem specifically. These are all things that Uber has just really not even tried to do. They accept cash payments. They do offer what they call cashless rides, which is basically Uber and Lyft as we know it, but understanding that there is a huge sector of their user base that either can't or is not interested in paying electronically, they found a way to accept cash. They just did it. They also, in addition to having a fully functional mobile-based application, I think it's more like a progressive web app. It does work from a desktop, so you can book a ride from a desktop computer, and they have SMS booking. This is a huge way in which they captured a big piece of the market. You don't have to have internet. You don't have to have a data plan. You don't have to be within 5G in order to book a ride with Ola Cabs. All you need to have is a phone that can send text messages and you've got a ride. So before I forget, they're the #1 rideshare service in India, but they've been so successful there. That's where they started, that they've actually expanded to Australia and the UK right now. They've actually been able to roll their success in this country into more developed countries where they're continuing to kind of serve the local markets there. All right, so I want to transition now more into the financial challenges that we were just talking about. AirTM is a really cool company. They're based in Mexico. The vast majority of their business is done in Venezuela, and they are totally rethinking currency exchange in the context of hyperinflation. Right now, they accept deposits from banks, gift cards, cash transfers, cryptocurrencies. They accept over 200 forms of payment. And the way that their system works, it's like a marketplace that allow any of these payments to be traded for US dollars. The hyperinflation situation in Venezuela right now is such that if you are being paid or receiving Venezuelan bolivars for whatever reason, really the only thing to do is try to convert them into something else. It's such an unstable currency right now that this is a huge need. They offer withdrawals through all the same mediums. So they're allowing folks that have the Venezuelan bolivar, this is, like I said, where they're doing most of their business. It's not exclusively for this. Any form whatsoever, linking them up with folks that are either buying or selling the US dollar. It's really just changing the way that people are able to deal with the situation down there. I mentioned earlier that PayPal fee can sometimes get up to something like 30% on top of everything. They've been able in some cases to lower it to 3% just by doing a one-way PayPal transfer with someone that's interested in buying bolivars. And then lastly, this is probably my favorite company that I found through this. I think that this is really, really cool. So Mobile ODT is based in Israel. They have developed a portable smartphone-enabled colposcope. Colposcope is a medical device that is used to perform a colposcopy, which is typically the step that comes after an abnormal pap smear. It's a cervical cancer screening. Cervical cancer is typically a treatable cancer, yet it kills hundreds of thousands of women every year. The vast, vast, vast majority of those women are typically residing in developing countries because it either just wasn't detected early enough. There's also a lot of challenges to treatment, but this is a huge, huge issue in the developing world. So just to give you a little bit of context, this chopped up picture over here is like an average colposcope. This is actually a little bit on the small end compared to some of the other ones out there. And more frequently, it'll be a device that looks like this, that's paired with a stand that has some sort of digital display with it that will really show the examination on it. So pretty big, probably about yay high, really only designed to be rolled from exam room to exam room within a doctor's office, and will range anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 in cost. Mobile ODT invented this. It's probably about the same size as the microphone that I'm holding. Can easily fit into a backpack. It costs under $2,000, sometimes under $1,000, and that's a smartphone that's popped right into it. Amazing. So they've managed to cut both the cost and the size by 90%. One of the things that this means is it can be used by nurses and physician's assistants in the field, and not exclusively by doctors in the hospital. So I know that one of the communities that I was working in when I was down in Bolivia got a lot of their healthcare from Doctors Without Borders and Cuban medical students that would travel to impoverished areas throughout Latin America offering to practice their health services. But because they were on foot, they weren't bringing an exam room with them and they weren't bringing a lot of equipment with them. So just to think through what something like this would allow them to do on those types of missions. But the other really cool thing about this product is it has implications in the first world as well. It's sold and used in this country, in the United States, and one of the things that it's really popular for here right now is forensic assault examinations. So colposcopy is sometimes required when completing a rape kit, but it allows forensic nurses to do it. It's far less invasive than having to roll in one of these big things into an exam room in a situation like that, and for that reason it's gaining a ton of traction in this country as well, which is maybe kind of an unintended design perk, but I think it's pretty cool. So just to kind of recap, we went through some of the challenges that we see in the developing world that we don't necessarily see on the same levels here when we're developing the first world. I kind of like to think of them as maybe a new level of acceptance criteria. Think something like building in one of the core features of your application to be enabled by SMS. I think I heard on NPR yesterday that there are huge parts of the Florida Panhandle right now that still don't have cell service as a result of a hurricane that came through over a week ago. I have to imagine that when that cell service eventually does get back up, the 5G is not going to be pumping like crazy and things aren't going to go back to normal right away. So if you're developing an application in which, might be useful in a situation like that, it's absolutely something worth considering. We talked through unsolved problems that really I'm looking at as opportunities if you're willing to just consider that different acceptance criteria, break into these markets. Not to say that they weren't creative, but I also like to really think of a lot of the solutions that we just looked at as inclusive. And we see that again with somebody like Ola Tabs being able to roll their success by considering more impoverished user base in these developing countries and roll that into success in the developing world. So again, my name is Carolyn Selheim-Miller. Thank you so much for spending the morning with me. I think I have a couple minutes. If anybody has questions, I'd be happy to take them. Mr. Romero. Yeah, so the question was around using terminology, developed world versus developing world, first world versus third world. And it's a really popular question, I think, and there's a lot of thought and reasoning around both sides of it. There's a lot of feelings around it. And I know that I probably use them a little bit interchangeably in these. For me, third world is not something that I try to use too often. And I think part of it is just, I feel that in this space, it's kind of started to have a connotation, almost a negative connotation associated with it. That's just my personal feeling, that I think the third world associates kind of an inability to develop and just think about poverty. And to me, I see them paired together. So it's also interesting, another one that we hear a lot is emerging markets, emerging economies. And that kind of goes back to my initial point about what is a developing country. That in itself can be a really subjective term. And it is something that it's important to be really cognizant of when we talk about this topic. Typically, emerging markets is a term that's sometimes reserved for countries that are right on the cusp. So what we consider the BRIC companies, Brazil, China, India, Russia, companies that are trying to get out of that topic. So to be perfectly honest, I don't have super strong feelings one way or the other. I know that it is a really ongoing conversation. I don't know if the social impact panel this afternoon will touch on that at all. That's going to be at 2 o'clock. That would be a really interesting question to pose to them as well. I don't have a good straightforward answer, but that's my personal feeling on it. Yeah. So the question is just around the role of cryptocurrencies and their enabling users in the developing world and all other parts of the world to move money outside of typical regulatory systems. I do think that's a huge it's really in a lot of places a game changer. I do think it's more of a game changer in places like Venezuela, where you have things like hyperinflation, where the actual currency, because in a situation like that, it's not just a matter of escaping fees or lowering fees, which, not to discredit that or say that that's not an issue in other places, but like I said, in places that are dealing with incredible hyperinflation, super high levels of corruption in their local economic and financial regulatory systems. There are a lot of places where the best thing that you can do with your local currency is get rid of it. And so I think that cryptocurrency does allow another way of doing that. And obviously being able to move the money internationally is absolutely huge. So AirTM actually started as a cryptocurrency trading platform, I want to say as early as like 2013. And then they really saw the way that Bitcoin in particular, among a couple of other cryptocurrencies, were just booming in Venezuela and completely pivoted their business model to start serving that. So that's one of the reasons that they do accept cryptocurrency, but they really looked at what was happening there, decided to also accept a whole bunch of other forms of payment and turn it around to solve that kind of problem. Yeah. So the question was around when, as first world developers, people that are developing here in the United States, if we are interested in penetrating other markets, what can we do to make sure that our products are relevant and take into consideration all the different things that maybe differ that market from the one that we're used to operating in and building for? And truthfully, I don't think the answer is really any different than what we should all be doing when we're developing here. And that's talking to our users, getting ingrained with what they want, what their needs are, the problem that we're trying to solve, how we need to solve it. I don't think it's any different. One of the things that Ola Cabs did is they dispatched a huge team of ethnographic researchers to go in and find out what would be needed, how they needed to build the structure in order to actually make rideshare accessible to a whole part of the population that wasn't actually used to utilizing it. So I think empathy is a huge piece of it, and just realizing that as developers, as people, when we're designing and building for other people, there's always things that we don't know. So it's our responsibility to go find out what they are. It might be a little bit harder. We may feel a little bit more than we don't know. So I think that the best answer is just to lean into that and find out and listen. Yeah, so the question's around the practice of actually sending various members of your delivery team down to kind of submerge in the market that you might be building for, and then linking back up with the team. Is that? Yeah, so that's not something that I'm super familiar with from an engineering perspective. I've not been on a team that does that. I definitely think that it's better than not doing something like that. You know, Taylor and I are working on a product right now that's working with the salon space particular, and we've sent various teams of various members of our team to go sit in a salon for a couple weeks. And obviously it's not this, in some ways it's not the same thing, but in some ways that's exactly what it is. I do think that for anything like that, it's important to have the training on what it is that you want to achieve out of that submersion. So maybe having a background in some sort of cultural anthropology, ethnographic research, learning how to sit and learn and watch and what to look for, and really just basic UX background. There's a lot of engineers out there that don't have that type of context in doing something like that. So I think something like that would actually really be strengthened by a little bit of just training before putting into it, but I don't see why it would hurt. James? You know, that's actually an interesting way of phrasing the question, because I'm not even necessarily suggesting that, and I need to think of the right way to say this, but that like we need to help, that we need to go down and solve other people's problems for them, for example. That's not necessarily where I'm coming from. One of the things, truthfully, that inspired me and got me thinking about this talk is I have a friend who has a really beautiful digital retail shop. She's Guatemalan. She lives in Miami right now. She's in the process of moving back to Guatemala. She sells like the most beautiful embroidered Panama hats. And I was with her in Guatemala in March. She said to me, yeah, you know, right now I'm just selling on Etsy because I don't have my site up and running yet. And of course my husband looked at her and was like, I know someone that can help you with a website. And she said, yeah, you know, the problem's on actually the website. I just haven't figured out what I want to do from an e-commerce perspective. And so we were like, well, can't she use PayPal? And she said, yeah, I could use PayPal, but if I have someone in Guatemala who purchases one of my hats that I'm going to ship to her from Guatemala, and I utilize PayPal as my e-commerce system, the money goes from the buyer back to the US, so there's an exchange fee there, to my friend Marcella into her PayPal account, and there's an international fee on top of that as well, so there's like an exchange rate, I think, in both directions actually, because if Marcella gets the money back in quetzales, which is the Guatemalan currency. And then when Marcella eventually wants to cash that money out, there's another fee, there's more exchange rate issues. So all of that added up to around a 14% hit per sale. Anybody who knows anything about retail, that's nuts. And she didn't really have another good alternative because there isn't a Guatemalan-based e-commerce platform that operates predominantly in quetzales. The banks that she uses down there do not have an API that's open for development that make that more possible. She's a smart businesswoman. She was still trying to figure out what she wanted to do, and right now Etsy was solving her problem. And it was really just the first time that I had really thought about it in that sense that, yeah, like PayPal is available to everyone in the US, but like, guess what? Not in the same way, or available to everyone in the world, but not in the same way that it is to us in the US. So to me, what I would hope that anybody would take out of this is just that there are problems that have been solved more as like market opportunities, but there's a lot of room for improvement. And it's not always necessarily from a place of helping. But like I said in the beginning, I think when we start to consider some of these challenges, some of these different user bases, the types of solutions that can come out are going to be completely different, and a lot of times a lot better than if we weren't thinking that way. So I think that's about all the time that I have. I want to let you guys go to your other talks, but you shouldn't leave. You should stay here. You should listen to Taylor. Thank you so much for your time.